Eleanor Marsh had lived in Millhaven, Montana for 68 years. She had been born in the small white house on Crestfield Road, 2 blocks from the elementary school, where she would eventually spend 32 years of her life, teaching children how to read, how to think, how to be kind to one another. She had buried her husband Harold in the hillside cemetery just north of town on a cold October afternoon 11 years ago, standing straight and dry-eyed, because Harold had told her once that grief was something you carried privately like a stone in your pocket. You did not set it down. You did not show it to strangers. You carried it and you kept walking, and over time, it became part of the weight you were used to. And that was how you survived it. She had buried her daughter, Catherine, 2 years ago this past September, in that same cemetery only a few plots away from Harold. And that time, Eleanor had not been able to stay dry-eyed at all. No stone in her pocket could fix that. Nothing could. Catherine had been 41 years old, and she had died the way some people die, too fast and too young. The cancer moving through her with a speed that seemed almost deliberate, as if it had somewhere else to be. Eleanor had sat beside her through all of it, every appointment and every night and every morning that Catherine woke uncertain whether she would see another one. She had held her daughter's hand at the end, and she had stayed in the room long after there was any reason to stay, because leaving felt like a second loss she was not ready to absorb. What remained after Catherine was Lily, 8 years old, small for her age, with tangled brown hair and dark, serious eyes that missed nothing. Lily was Catherine's daughter entirely, from the stubborn set of her chin to the way she tilted her head when she was thinking hard about something. Eleanor recognized her daughter in the child every single day sometimes, in a way that broke her open quietly like a seam giving way in old fabric. A small internal tearing that she had learned to acknowledge and then move past, because there was always something that needed doing. And grief, as Harold had taught her, was carried privately. But Lily was also her own person entirely and unmistakably. She was funny in unexpected ways, with a dry precision that surprised adults who were not paying attention. She collected interesting rocks she found near the creek and kept them in a cigar box she had found in the garage, organized by color and texture, according to a system she had developed herself. She talked to Cooper, the old mixed-breed dog who had belonged to Catherine and who now belonged to everyone and no one, in a soft, steady voice, as if the two of them were having a reasonable conversation, and she expected him to respond at any moment. Sometimes she reported back to Eleanor on what Cooper had said, and Eleanor always listened to these reports with the attention they deserved. Cooper was 11 years old. His muzzle had gone completely gray. He moved slowly now, with the patient economy of an animal who had learned over many years that the ground rewarded care and punished haste. But his eyes were still clear and warm, carrying in them the particular intelligence of old dogs who have been loved well and know it. When Eleanor sat in the kitchen in the early morning before anyone else was awake, Cooper would always find her and press his head against her knee. And that small gesture of loyalty was worth more to Eleanor than most things she could name. She had long since stopped trying to name it precisely, and simply accepted it as one of the reliable good things in a life that had recently contained fewer of those than she was accustomed to. Then there was Derek. Derek Holt was 42 years old. He was not a cruel man in any obvious way. He did not raise his voice in anger. He did not drink. He kept the house clean and paid his bills on time, and showed up where he said he would show up. He had loved Catherine. Eleanor believed that. Or at least he had loved the version of Catherine that fit neatly inside his plans, the capable and self-sufficient woman who asked little and managed everything around her with quiet efficiency. But Derek was a man who saw the world as a series of problems to be managed efficiently. And after Catherine died, the problems multiplied in ways that seemed to exhaust him visibly, day by day in small increments that Eleanor watched from her careful position in the spare bedroom. A child who needed everything and could not yet provide anything in return. A dog who tracked mud across the clean floors and required twice daily walks in weather that was not always convenient. And an elderly mother-in-law who occupied the spare bedroom, who cooked meals he sometimes did not come home to eat, who sat in the living room reading to Lily every night, even when Derek had already decided it was time for Lily to go to sleep. Eleanor had tried to be invisible. It was a skill she had refined over the 23 months since Catherine died, the art of occupying space without requiring acknowledgement of it. She kept her things in her room. She did not offer opinions on how Derek ran the house unless specifically asked, and she was not specifically asked. She helped with Lily in ways that could be understood as practical support rather than criticism of Derek's parenting, because she had spent 32 years in classrooms learning to read the difference between a situation that would benefit from direct intervention and one that required a more oblique approach. She fed Cooper quietly and walked him in the early mornings before Derek woke up. She left the kitchen clean after using it, and she did not leave personal items in the common areas, and she contributed whatever money she could from her teacher's pension to the household expenses without making a point of it. She told herself this was manageable. She told herself that what love required was exactly this kind of sustained, invisible effort. The kind that no one noticed precisely because it was working. She had been wrong about that, but she did not know it yet. The night it happened was the 23rd of November. Eleanor knew the date because she had been thinking about Thanksgiving that morning, turning over the small domestic problem of whether to ask Derek about his plans for the holiday, or simply wait to be told the way she had learned to wait for most things in that house. The sky had been low and steel-colored all day, pressing down on the town, like something that had already made a decision about what the night would bring. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours. Eleanor had watched it happen from the kitchen window, tracking the way the trees along the fence line went stiff with it, and the light flattened out into something almost lavender, before disappearing entirely into the early dark of a Montana November. She had made soup. She did this sometimes when the cold came in hard, because it was something useful she could do without getting in the way of anything. And because Lily loved the smell of it, had loved it since she was small enough to be held while it cooked, pressing her face into Eleanor's shoulder and breathing in the steam. Eleanor had set 3 bowls on the table and called Lily in from the living room and waited for Derek, who came home at 6:15 smelling like the cold outside, and something else she could not quite name. Something finished. Something settled. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the soup, and then looked at Eleanor in a way she had not seen before. Not angry, not tired in the usual evening way. Something more composed than either of those things, the expression of a man who has made a decision and is past the point of reconsidering it. He sat down at the table. He did not pick up his spoon. Eleanor sat across from him. Lily sat between them, already eating with the focused attention she gave to food she liked. But her dark eyes moved carefully from face to face, in the way that children do when they understand that something is happening in the adult world around them, even if they cannot identify what it is. Derek said he had accepted a position in Seattle. He said it the way someone announces a weather forecast, informatively, without particular emotion attached to the information itself. The position was with a firm he had been in contact with for several months. It started in January. The house would go on the market after the new year. and he had already spoken with a realtor about pricing and timing. Eleanor set down her spoon. She asked quietly what this meant for Lily. Derek said that Lily would come with him, that he was Lily's father, and that was a settled legal matter that required no further discussion. He said that the new apartment in Seattle was not large. He said this without quite completing the thought, allowing the implication to stand in place of the direct statement. But Eleanor was 68 years old, and she had spent 32 years in a classroom reading the distance between what people said aloud and what they meant by it. She understood him without difficulty. She asked him to say it plainly. Derek looked at her across the table with the expression of a man doing something unpleasant that he has nevertheless decided is necessary, and he said that there was not a place for her in the new arrangement, that she must have other options, that surely there were people she could contact, programs she could look into, something the state provided for situations like this one. He said it as if he were suggesting she look into a library membership. The room went very quiet after that. Lily had stopped eating. The spoon she had been holding was resting against the rim of the bowl. Cooper, who had been lying near the back door in his usual evening position, lifted his gray head and looked at Eleanor with those clear, warm eyes that always seemed to contain more understanding than was strictly explicable. Eleanor thought about several things in the space of the next few seconds. She thought about the 32 years she had given to this town and this school, and the children who had passed through her classroom. She thought about Harold, who had died 11 years ago, leaving her with the conviction, earned over 40 years of marriage, that she was capable of enduring most things if she approached them honestly. She thought about Catherine, who had made her promise once during those last terrible months of illness, when the morphine had been increased and the days had begun to blur at the edges. But the moments of clarity were still very clear, that she would not let anything separate her from Lily. Not anything. Catherine had been specific about this in a way that admitted no reinterpretation. Eleanor did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She set both hands flat on the table and felt the solidity of the wooden surface beneath her palms, the ordinary, reliable fact of it, and she made herself breathe twice before she spoke. She said that she understood. Derek nodded with the brief satisfaction of a man who has resolved a scheduling conflict. She asked him how long she had. He said he thought tonight was as good a time as any, that he had already spoken to a colleague who had a room available in a building on Maple. He said this had been coming for a long time, and that drawing it out would not help anyone involved. He said the word anyone in a way that suggested he had thought carefully about who was actually involved and had narrowed the category considerably. Eleanor looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. She held his gaze without aggression and without submission, the way she had looked at a great many people in a great many difficult moments over the course of 68 years. And then she pushed back her chair and stood up and walked around the table to where Lily sat. She crouched down in front of her granddaughter. Lily's eyes were very wide. Her lower lip was trembling, but she was holding it still through the particular kind of will that Eleanor recognized from Catherine, the stubborn, internal clenching that refused to let fear become performance. Eleanor told her to put on her warmest coat, her boots, her scarf, and her gloves, to pack her backpack with the things she wanted most. Lily looked past Eleanor at Derek. Then she looked back. She asked if they were leaving together. Eleanor said yes. Lily nodded once with the decisive completeness of someone who has received sufficient information and slid off her chair and walked to her room without another word, her small back straight, her worn pink backpack already in her hand before she reached the door. Derek said that he had not invited Eleanor to take Lily anywhere, that Lily was staying, that this was his house, and his daughter and Eleanor had no legal standing to remove a minor child from the residence of her legal guardian. Eleanor turned and looked at him. She had been a teacher for 32 years. She had looked at a great many people telling her things she disagreed with, in tones ranging from uncertain to aggressive. And she had learned that the most important thing was to remain exactly who she was while they did it. She said very quietly that Lily was not staying without her, that if he wanted to test, that she was prepared to stand in this kitchen through the entire night and into tomorrow morning. Something shifted in Derek's face. Not guilt. She did not think it was guilt exactly. It was more like the small, mechanical recalibration of a man reassessing the weight of an obstacle and deciding whether it was worth the effort of moving it by force or whether it was simpler to let it move itself. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said fine, that she would regret this before winter was out, that he was not responsible for what happened to either of them once they were off his property. He walked to the living room and sat down and turned on the television and did not look at them again. 10 minutes later, Eleanor stood on the front lawn with a single duffel bag over her shoulder, containing 2 changes of clothes, a small amount of cash, a lighter she had carried in her coat pocket for 20 years, and a thermometer she had found in the kitchen drawer at the last moment and taken on an instinct she did not yet understand. Lily stood beside her with her worn pink backpack clutched against her chest, her small face pale and composed in the cold air. Cooper pressed against Eleanor's leg, his warm weight both comforting and frightening in its vulnerability. Behind them, the porch light clicked off. The temperature was 11 degrees Fahrenheit and still dropping. Eleanor looked down at Lily. Lily looked up at her. The little girl asked very softly where they were going. Eleanor straightened her back. She adjusted the strap of the duffel bag on her shoulder. She felt the cold move through her coat and touch her bones in the deep way that Montana cold in late November touches you. And she acknowledged it the way you acknowledge something that is real and must be dealt with without flinching from it. She said they would figure it out, and Lily, who trusted her grandmother, the way very young children trust the people who have never given them a reason not to said okay, and meant it entirely, they started walking. Millhaven at night in late November is a town that folds into itself. The lights behind curtains, the wood smoke rising from chimneys in slow columns that the cold air holds together longer than it should. Trucks warming up in driveways for 5 minutes before anyone gets in the exhaust, making white clouds in the dark. Eleanor had walked these streets for 68 years, and they were as familiar to her as the lines on her own hands. But that night, everything looked different. Not because the streets had changed, but because her relationship to them had. The distance between herself and all that warmth behind all those windows felt enormous in a way that had nothing to do with physical distance. It was the difference between belonging to a place and simply existing near it. And she felt that difference in her chest, like a change in pressure. They passed the feed store where she had bought birdseed for 30 years. They passed the diner where she had eaten breakfast every Saturday morning for as long as she could remember, sitting in the third booth from the window with coffee and the newspaper. They passed the elementary school, its windows dark, its flagpole bare in the November wind, and Eleanor did not look at the school for very long because looking at it for very long was not something she could afford just then. Lily walked beside her without complaint, her small boots crunching on the frost-hardened sidewalk, with a sound that was oddly comforting in its regularity. Cooper kept pace slower than he used to be, his breath making small clouds in the cold air that drifted back and disappeared. They reached the north edge of town, where the road ended and the limestone hills began. Most people in Millhaven thought of these hills as essentially useless, rocky and uneven, difficult to build on, not worth farming, not dramatic enough to attract serious hikers. The county had looked at them twice over the decades for potential development and decided there was nothing practical to be done. They were simply there, patient and old and overlooked the way many useful things are overlooked until the moment when they are needed. Eleanor stopped at the base of the trail and looked up into the darkness of the hillside. It had been 4 years since she had been up there. She and Harold used to go every October on the second Sunday of the month, a ritual they had maintained for 30 years, with the kind of quiet faithfulness that long marriages sometimes develop around the things that matter most to them. They would bring sandwiches and a thermos of coffee and sit on the flat shelf of limestone near the rock hollow and look out at the valley and talk about things they did not talk about in the house. Important things and unimportant things. The texture of the years. What they were grateful for. What they were worried about. What they expected from the time that remained. It was Harold who had first noticed the hollow. A shallow depression in the hillside, where the limestone curved inward on 3 sides, protected from wind on all but one face. Harold had been a craftsman for 25 years working with wood and stone, and the structural logic of materials, and he brought to everything he looked at the particular attention of someone who understood how things held together and why they sometimes did not. He had pressed his palm flat against the back wall of the hollow and turned to Eleanor with that specific expression he got when he was genuinely interested in something. The expression that meant he was about to explain something she should pay attention to. He had told her that the earth held its own warmth in a place like this. Not dramatically, not in any way you could feel standing in it on a warm autumn afternoon, but steadily and reliably in the deep, slow way of stone and packed earth that did not respond to the surface temperature the way air did. He said it was geology and physics, not magic, and then explained it the way he explained everything technical, patiently and without condescension, as if the information itself were the interesting thing, and the only question worth addressing was whether she understood it yet. He talked about thermal mass, about how stone absorbed heat over long hours and released it over longer ones. He talked about the configuration of the hollow, and how the inward curve on 3 sides interrupted wind and held whatever warmth the low winter sun could provide. He talked about the angle of the hillside relative to the winter sun and why south-facing exposure mattered in the cold months in a way it did not in summer. Then he had said, looking out at the valley with his coffee in his hand, that if the world ever kicked hard enough, she should remember this place. Eleanor had been 57 then, sitting in October sunshine with her husband's warm hand over hers, and the idea that the world would ever kick hard enough to make a limestone hollow on a forgotten hillside relevant had seemed remote enough to be theoretical. She had filed the information the way she filed many things, Harold said carefully, and in a place she could retrieve it without fully understanding yet what it was for. Standing at the base of that hill at 11 degrees Fahrenheit, with her granddaughter and her old dog, and a single duffel bag, Eleanor understood what it was for. She felt something she did not have a precise word for, not quite gratitude and not quite grief, but something that had the texture of both, something that moved through her chest, like a hand pressing gently on a bruise. She thought of Harold, and she thought of the decades they had spent on this hillside. And she thought about the fact that he had, in some sense she could not entirely account for, prepared her for this specific night, without either of them knowing that was what he was doing. She told Lily they were going up, Lily looked at the hill in the darkness. She looked at Cooper. She looked at Eleanor. She said, "Okay." The climb was harder than Eleanor remembered, and she had expected it to be hard. She was 68 years old, and the cold had already tightened everything. Her joints and her breath and the muscles across her shoulders and down her back. And the trail was uneven and slick with frost, in a way that required her to test each step before committing to it the careful, deliberate way you navigate anything that might not hold. Lily slipped twice. The second time, Eleanor caught her by the arm and then made a decision and simply hoisted her onto her back and carried her the rest of the way with her legs burning and her lungs working hard in the thin, cold air. Lily held on without being told to, and without comment, her small arms around Eleanor's neck, her face pressed against the collar of Eleanor's coat. Cooper struggled on the loose rock of the upper trail, stopping twice on sections where the footing was worst. Each time he stopped, Eleanor also stopped speaking to him in the quiet, steady voice she used when she needed something to keep going, despite good reasons to do otherwise. She told him they were almost there. She told him he was doing well. She told him the same kinds of things she had told children in her classroom over 32 years when the work was hard and the end was not yet in sight. He kept going. When they finally reached the hollow, the wind cut off almost immediately, dropping from the sustained cutting force that had been working against them on the open slope to something much closer to stillness. It was not warm. Nothing about that moment was warm in any comfortable sense, but the quality of the air was different, less aggressive, and Eleanor felt it first in her face the way the tearing stopped, and the air simply held around her instead of moving through her. She lowered Lily to the ground and stood for a moment with her hands on her knees catching her breath. Then she straightened and looked around at what Harold had shown her 11 years ago. The hollow was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply seeing it differently now through the eye of someone assessing it for practical use, rather than appreciating it as a place to eat sandwiches and talk about the texture of the years. Dirt floor compacted and dry. Rough stone walls curved inward on 3 sides. The limestone pale and cold in the darkness. Dry leaves pushed into the corners by animals who had found it useful at some point and left. The smell of cold earth and something older than weather. The particular mineral smell of stone that has been in the same place for a very long time. Lily sat down and hugged her knees and looked around at everything with wide, careful eyes, processing it with the serious attention she gave to new situations. She asked if it was safe. Eleanor crouched in front of her, brushing the tangled hair from Lily's face, with hands that trembled, though not entirely from the cold. She said that for tonight it was, that she was certain of that. Cooper folded himself down beside Lily with a long, slow exhale, the sound of an old animal settling into the posture of rest, and rested his gray muzzle on her knee. Lily put her hand on top of his head and held it there, her fingers curled into his fur. Eleanor sat with her back against the stone wall and looked out at the dark valley below. The lights of Millhaven glittered at the bottom of the hill, small and yellow and indifferent. Every one of them behind glass and curtain, every one of them representing a kitchen with heat and a bed with blankets, and the ordinary, reliable warmth of a building that was doing what buildings were built to do. She thought about Derek sitting in the living room with the television on. She thought about Catherine, who was beyond all of this now, and also somehow present in every moment of it, present in Lily's face, and in the promise Eleanor had made, and in the deep internal certainty that she was not going to let this be the end of anything. Then she stopped thinking about what was lost and started thinking about what was possible. This was a shift she had made many times in her life, across many kinds of difficulty, and she knew how to make it. It was not a denial of the loss. It was a decision about where to put the attention that remained. She did not have a plan. She had a hollow in a limestone hill and a bag with 2 changes of clothes and a small amount of cash and a lighter and a thermometer and 68 years of accumulated knowledge about how things worked, including the specific knowledge Harold had given her on this hillside 11 years ago, about how stone and earth and light worked together in the cold months. That was what she had. She looked at it honestly, without false comfort and without despair, the way she used to look at a difficult classroom situation before deciding what to do about it. The inventory was not empty. It was not what she would have chosen. But it was real, and real was what she had to work with. She told herself very quietly in the cold dark of the hollow that she would not let them fall apart. Not that night. Not any night that followed it. Morning came without warmth. Eleanor woke before dawn from a shallow, uncomfortable sleep. Her back aching from the stone, her fingers stiff in a way that required several minutes of careful, deliberate movement before they would cooperate properly. For one suspended and disorienting moment, she expected to hear the sounds of the house. The coffee maker cycling on, the heat clicking through the baseboards, the particular quality of silence that belongs to a building that is keeping people warm and does not need to announce it. Instead, there was wind, low and continuous, moving past the entrance of the hollow, with a sound like something breathing that had decided not to stop. Lily was still asleep, curled tight under the coat Eleanor had laid over her in the night, her face drawn in sleep, but peaceful. Cooper lay beside her, his eyes already open, watching Eleanor with the attentive calm of an animal who had made a decision to trust the person in charge of the situation and was now simply waiting to see what that person was going to do next. Eleanor pushed herself to her feet slowly and stood at the edge of the hollow, looking out at the pale gray sky of early winter morning, the color that contains no promise of warmth, but at least contains light. And she thought. She used the lighter to start a small fire from the dry leaves in the corners of the hollow and the twigs she had gathered from the slope below, before dark the previous evening. The flames were weak and tentative, but they were real and they were hers. She cupped her hands near them and felt the small warmth and thought about what came next. When Lily woke, she looked around with the particular alertness of a child who had processed where she was while sleeping and was now fully accounting for it in waking. Then she looked at Eleanor. She asked if they were going home today. Eleanor kept her face steady and her voice even. She said not yet. She said they were okay. She said she had a plan. The second part was more true than the first. She did not yet have a plan in the complete and detailed sense of the word. She had the beginning of one, which at this stage was perhaps more valuable anyway, because finished plans rarely survive contact with conditions like these intact, and a direction is more durable than a map. Lily said okay in the same way she had said it on the lawn in front of Derek's house, with the particular uncomplicated trust that Eleanor understood was the most fragile and most important thing in the hollow with them. They spent the morning working. Eleanor walked the edges of town with the careful route selection of someone who understands that purposeful movement draws less attention than hesitant movement. A lesson from 32 years of managing rooms full of children who were always watching for uncertainty. Behind the hardware store, she found cardboard dry and intact, good pieces leaning against the wall near the dumpster, as if waiting to be found. Behind the grocery store, she found a torn tarp and a plastic bin with a cracked lid that would still hold. Near the construction site on Meridian Street, she found scraps of foam insulation, pink and crumbling at the edges, but functional, and some lengths of bent metal strip that she examined carefully and took. She made 2 trips up the hill, the second one harder than the first. Lily helped where she could, her small hands surprisingly precise and steady. By mid-morning, 2 men were standing at the base of the trail. Eleanor heard their voices carrying up the slope in the cold air before she saw who they were. One said he would not have believed it if he was not seeing it with his own eyes. The other said it was a damn shame. The first said that was the Marsh woman, the teacher. The second said he had heard she got herself thrown out and took the granddaughter with her. Eleanor kept walking. She had spent 32 years managing other people's opinions of her choices and her methods. She had learned that the most powerful response to skepticism was to continue working and let the work answer what words never adequately could. Back in the hollow, she lined the stone walls with the cardboard starting at the base and overlapping the pieces the way Harold had taught her to overlap shingles on a repair job, each piece sitting over the one below it, so that moisture traveled down and out instead of in. She packed leaves and loose dirt against the gaps. She stretched the tarp across the lower half of the entrance at a downward angle, staking it with sticks jammed into the earth at the edges, creating a barrier that broke the wind without sealing out the light. The plastic bin she positioned at the back to collect whatever moisture came off the walls in the night. When she stepped back and assessed what she had done, she felt a small but real shift in the quality of the air inside. Just a degree or 2 of difference, not comfort. Nothing close to comfort, but the specific difference between impossible and merely very hard, which was the only distinction that mattered at this stage. Lily stepped in and out of the hollow, twice testing it, the way a scientist tests a hypothesis. She said it was better. Eleanor nodded. It was. That afternoon, they went back into town for supplies. Eleanor moved with economy and purpose, collecting what was available without taking what was not given. A distinction she maintained scrupulously. At the church on 4th Street, she went through the side door to the small overflow pantry, where Pastor Greer left the excess from Sunday donations with a handwritten note that said, "Please take what you need." She took 2 cans of soup, a box of crackers, a small bag of oats. She left a note with her name on it because she intended to pay it back, and she wanted there to be a record of the intention. On the way back, they passed a group outside the hardware store. 3 men and a woman people Eleanor had known for decades, 2 of whom had been her students. They all went quiet when they saw her. The woman said her name uncertainly. Eleanor said good morning and kept walking. Behind her, she heard one of the men say something she could not make out, and then someone said the word rocks, and then someone laughed. The short, embarrassed sound of a person who is not entirely comfortable with themselves, but cannot quite stop. Eleanor did not look back. That evening, as the fire did its small, inadequate work against the cold, and Lily ate crackers with the focused attention she gave to food. When she was genuinely hungry, the little girl asked a question that hung in the air of the hollow like wood smoke. She asked if people were laughing at them. Eleanor was quiet for long enough to decide that the truth was more useful here than comfort. She said that some probably were. Lily turned a cracker over in her hands. Then she said she did not care. She said she liked it better when it was just them. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter in the firelight, at the small, serious face that was so completely Catherine's and also so completely its own thing, and felt something move through her that she did not have a precise name for. It was not pride exactly, though. It was in the neighborhood of pride. It was closer to recognition, the feeling of seeing something in another person that you also know to be true in yourself. She pulled Lily against her side and held her without speaking. Over the next several days, a pattern established itself. Eleanor woke before dawn and worked until the light went. She tested the hollow's thermal properties with patient attention, noting which walls held warmth longest into the night, identifying where air moved through gaps she had missed, and sealing them methodically. She watched the angle at which the weak winter sun entered the hollow during the narrow hours it was high enough to reach them, and she thought about how to use it better. She was aware that this process looked from the outside like an old woman losing her grip on reason. Word was moving through Millhaven the way word always moved through a town of this size, quickly and with embellishment in both directions. Some of it more sympathetic than the truth, and some considerably less. She heard it in fragments indirectly, the way you hear things when you are on the outside of a social fabric that is talking about you. At the diner one morning, a conversation stopped when she came in that told her she had been its subject. Near the school, a woman she had taught beside for 6 years gave her a look of such concentrated pity that Eleanor had to remind herself silently and with some firmness that pity was not the same as judgment, even though it sometimes felt identical from the receiving end. A truck slowed on the road below the trail one afternoon. A man she recognized leaned out the window and said she could not live up there. He said it was dangerous and she was making a mistake. He said it with the tone of someone who genuinely believes they are being helpful and does not understand why that is not sufficient. Eleanor looked at him. She said they were fine. He shook his head and drove away. That night, the temperature fell below zero before midnight. The fire struggled. Cooper whimpered softly in his sleep, his breathing audible in the enclosed space in a way that sent a thin, cold spike of fear through Eleanor's chest. Lily coughed once, twice, a dry, echoing sound against the stone. Eleanor sat awake after Lily fell back to sleep, pressed against the stone wall, listening to the wind driving itself against the hillside with its uncaring persistence. She thought about every voice that had, in one way or another, been telling her the same thing, that this was wrong, that she was failing, that what she was doing was stubbornness dressed up as survival, and there was an important difference between the two. She pressed her palm flat against the stone wall and held it there. The stone was not warm, but it was not as cold as the air outside. The differential was small, but it was real and it was consistent, and it did not waver when the wind changed direction. This was the thermal mass Harold had described holding its ground against the season. The way solid things hold ground through mass and patience rather than force. She pressed her palm harder against the surface and thought about what he had said on this hillside 11 years ago, that the earth held its own warmth here, that you just had to pay attention. She paid attention. She began to understand something she had not understood before. The hollow was not fighting winter. It was enduring it the way old things endure through density and patience and the fundamental refusal to be moved by what passes over the surface. She had been approaching the problem as insulation trying to keep the cold out. But the stone was doing something different. It was absorbing and holding and releasing on its own timeline, indifferent to the weather above it. She needed to stop working against the cold and start working with the rock, to cooperate with what the stone was already doing instead of around it. A direction began to form, not a finished plan. Something better than a finished plan at this stage. She sat with it through the long, cold night, turning it over the way she had turned over difficult problems in the classroom, looking at it from every angle, testing where it might fail. By the time the sky began to lighten, she had a clear enough picture of what she wanted to try. She did not sleep. Instead, she talked to Harold. Not aloud, not exactly, but in the interior conversation that long marriages make possible, even after one person is no longer there to answer. She described the angle of the hillside and the quality of the rock, and what she had in mind for the broken glass she had noticed stacked behind the old Ketterman barn on Ridgeline Road. She told him she remembered everything he had explained about thermal mass and south-facing exposure. She told him she was paying attention. She did not hear him answer, but she felt in the cold stillness of that early morning, with the stone solid beneath her hand, and the darkness thinning outside, the particular confidence that comes not from certainty but from competence, from understanding the problem well enough to begin working on it. She did not know yet that 3 days earlier, Derek Holt had driven to the county office building on Turner Street and sat down across from a caseworker and described in careful detail the conditions in which his mother-in-law was keeping his stepdaughter. She did not know that a file had been opened and a welfare check scheduled for 3 weeks out. She did not know that Derek had also, on that same afternoon, called the realtor he had hired in October and told her to proceed with listing the house, and that the conversation had touched briefly on the question of the child's custody status and how it might affect the sale timeline. She did not know any of this. What she knew was the hollow and the rock and the angle of the winter sun that would return in a few hours and begin its narrow arc across the southern sky. And she knew Lily was asleep beside her, with her small hand resting open on the dirt floor between them, trusting the dark completely. That was enough to begin. The idea came to her fully formed in the hour before sunrise, the way the best ideas always had, not as inspiration, but as recognition. Something she already understood arranging itself into the shape it needed to take. She had been watching the light. Not the light inside the hollow, which was the orange and amber of the fire, doing its patient work, but the light outside. The way winter light moved across the hillside was different from summer light lower, and more oblique, arriving at an angle that most people experienced as insufficient. But Harold had pointed out years ago that low winter sun was actually more useful for certain purposes than the high summer sun, if you knew how to receive it properly. The key was surface area and angle of incidence. You needed to meet the light where it actually was, not where you wished it would be. Eleanor had been thinking about the glass stacked against the Ketterman barn. She had seen it 2 days ago on one of her supply runs, old window sections leaning against the barn wall. Some cloudy with age, some cracked at the corners, but most of them substantially intact. She had noted them with the inventory habit she had developed over weeks of looking at the town's discarded materials as a resource rather than waste. She thought it through before Lily woke. The entrance to the hollow faced roughly south, perhaps 15 degrees off true south, close enough. If she built a frame at the entrance and mounted the glass sections in it at the right angle, the low winter sun would strike them directly during the middle hours of the day, the hours when it was highest in its narrow arc. The light coming through would hit the stone floor and the back wall. Stone absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. That was the principle Harold had been describing all those years ago, on this same hillside. You charged the stone during the day, and it paid you back through the night. Not dramatically, not like a radiator, but steadily and reliably, and without requiring any fuel. The gaps between glass sections could be sealed with strips of cloth and mud, which would freeze hard and form its own insulating seal. It would look, she knew, completely unreasonable from the outside. An elderly woman pressing broken windows into a hole in a hillside. But she had spent too many years in a classroom to mistake how something appeared for what it actually was. What mattered was whether it worked. She was outside before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, moving down the hill with the careful economy of someone who understood that her energy was a resource with limits that had to be managed. Cooper watched her go from the entrance. Lily slept. The Ketterman barn was 20 minutes from the base of the hill. Eleanor arrived as the owner, Aldous Ketterman, was coming out of his back door with a coffee mug in both hands and the expression of someone who has not yet fully decided to be awake. He was in his 70s, broad through the shoulders with white hair, and the permanently tired eyes of a man who had been working Montana winters long enough to stop expecting them to be other than what they were. He looked at her without particular surprise. People in small towns who have known each other their entire lives rarely register surprise at each other's appearances, even when those appearances are unexpected by any reasonable standard. Eleanor told him what she needed and why. She was direct about both because she had no patience for approximation and no time to spend on it. She explained the angle of the hollow entrance, the principle of solar gain against thermal mass, what she expected the glass to do, and why she thought it would work. She used the specific words Harold had used because they were the right words, and using approximations of them would be less clear, and she needed to be clear. Aldous Ketterman stood with his coffee and listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said he had heard she was living up in the rocks. Eleanor said that was correct. He looked at her for a moment with those tired, practical eyes. He said people thought she had lost her mind. Eleanor said people thought a great many things. He looked at the glass stacked against his barn. He looked back at her. He said the glass was no use to him and she could take it. He said there was a cart in the barn with one wheel that pulled left. She thanked him. She meant it without qualification. The cart held the glass without complaint, which was its main virtue. The wheel that pulled left was manageable if you leaned into it consistently. Eleanor made 2 trips up the hill with the glass, the second one nearly beyond what she had available. Her arms shook on the last section of slope, and she had to stop 3 times standing in the cold, with her chest burning and her legs shaking, looking at the distance remaining, refusing to put the cart down, because she was not entirely certain she could pick it up again. She put it down once. She stood still for 2 minutes and breathed. She picked it up and got it to the hollow. Lily was standing at the entrance with Cooper beside her, watching Eleanor come up the last section of trail with an expression that was both concerned and very interested. She asked what all the glass was for. Eleanor said she was going to change things. Lily considered this and nodded as if it were a complete and sufficient explanation, which for her purposes it apparently was. The building took 3 days. It was imprecise and frustrating work that required constant adjustment and the willingness to undo what you had just done when it was not right and try it differently. The frame she constructed from the plywood scraps and the bent metal strips was not elegant. It leaned slightly to the left, and she braced it with stones on the downhill side. The glass sections did not fit together cleanly, and she packed the gaps with strips cut from the extra shirt in her duffel bag, then pressed mud over them in layers, waiting for each layer to begin hardening before adding the next, working in the cold with her hands wrapped in cloth strips, because the skin over her knuckles had cracked and bled, and she needed them functional more than she needed them comfortable. On the 3rd afternoon, she stepped back and looked at what she had made. It was not beautiful. It was purposeful. She had learned over 68 years that these 2 qualities were often unrelated, and that the second was the one that mattered when the situation was serious. The sun was at its low winter height, moving through its narrow arc. It struck the glass at the angle she had calculated and sent pale winter light into the back section of the hollow. Not bright light, not warm light, not yet, but light that was doing something when it hit the stone staying there, rather than bouncing away, beginning the slow process of charging the thermal mass, the way Harold had described. She pressed her hand against the back wall in the early evening, and it was fractionally measurably less cold than the air inside the hollow. Several degrees, enough to register on the thermometer she had carried in her pocket since the first night. Enough to notice if you were paying attention. Lily stepped inside and stood very still. She said, "It felt different." Eleanor said, "Yes." She said it felt softer somehow, like the air was less sharp. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter and felt something move through her chest that she recognized carefully, and without letting herself lean too hard on it, as hope. That night, for the first time since they had come to the hollow, Lily slept without shivering. Eleanor did not sleep at all. She sat watching the condensation form on the inside of the glass. In the dark, watching the small proof of temperature differential marking itself on the surface, and she felt something shift in her understanding of what this place could be. Not certainty. She was too old and too honest to confuse hope with certainty, but a real shift, and she held it with the care you give to something fragile that you intend to make more durable. She began thinking about soil. Harold had kept a garden on the south side of the house in Millhaven, a strip 12 feet long and 4 feet wide, where he grew tomatoes and peppers and a variety of squash he had been partial to, for reasons he never fully explained. He had been methodical about it, composting through the winter, amending the soil in fall, treating the whole enterprise with the same serious attention he gave to his craft. Eleanor had absorbed more of his method than she realized at the time, in the way you absorb things from people you love. Before you know you will need them. The soil at the back of the hollow against the wall, now receiving the most direct solar gain through the glass, was loose and dry and undisturbed. The thermal conditions were improving. If she amended that soil and introduced seeds, the combination of reflected heat from the stone and solar gain through the glass and the insulating mass of the surrounding earth might be enough to support germination. Not a garden, nothing close to a garden, but something alive in a rock hollow in December in Montana would be its own kind of evidence about what was possible here. She collected organic material on her supply runs, coffee grounds from the bin behind the diner, vegetable scraps from behind the grocery, decomposed leaves from the sheltered side of the hill where wind had piled them against an outcrop, and they had begun to break down into something darker and richer. She mixed it into the soil at the back of the hollow and turned it by hand and pressed seeds into it. Seeds she bought with the last of her cash, from the hardware store, counting out the bills with the precision of someone for whom each dollar had a specific and non-negotiable weight. Lily helped with the planting. Her small hands were precise in the way children's hands sometimes are, careful and unhurried in a way that adults with too many competing concerns often cannot manage. Eleanor asked her what she thought they were planting. Lily thought about it with genuine seriousness. She said she thought they were planting something that would prove people wrong. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter for a long moment. She said that was exactly right. 12 days after they had first come up the hill, someone knocked on the glass. Eleanor was working at the back of the hollow. The sound was so unexpected in that context that for a moment she simply looked at the entrance without moving. Lily looked up. Cooper raised his gray head and made a low sound in his throat that was more assessment than alarm. A woman stood outside, bundled in a long, dark coat, her hands clasped in front of her in the manner of someone who has prepared what they intended to say and is now uncertain whether the preparation was adequate. Eleanor did not recognize her. She was perhaps 40, with the composed professional manner of someone accustomed to conducting difficult conversations in unfamiliar places. A stranger in Millhaven, where strangers were noticeable. Eleanor stepped toward the entrance. The woman said her name was Dorothea Vance, and that she was from the County Department of Child Protective Services. She said she had received a report about the living situation, and she was required by her department's protocols to conduct a welfare assessment of the minor child. Eleanor felt her heart do something complicated. She kept her face still and her breathing even. Behind Dorothea, one step back and slightly to the left, stood Derek. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and his expression was the carefully neutral one of a man who believes the situation is already moving in his direction. He was looking at the glass wall with an expression that was trying to present itself as concern, and landing several degrees closer to satisfaction. Eleanor stepped aside and gestured for Dorothea to come in. Dorothea entered and stopped. She looked around the hollow slowly and completely, the way a person looks at something when they are genuinely trying to understand it, rather than confirm what they arrived expecting to find. She looked at the glass wall and the light it admitted. She looked at the cardboard insulation and the careful arrangement of the space. She looked at the fire and the small planting bed at the back. She looked at Lily, who was sitting beside Cooper, with a book open in her lap, and at Cooper, who regarded the visitor with the calm assessment of an animal who has decided to reserve judgment until more information is available. She took out a notebook and wrote something in it. Derek said from the entrance that he wanted the record to reflect the conditions. Dorothea said she was making a complete record of the conditions. She crouched in front of Lily and spoke to her quietly and directly, without the forced brightness that adults sometimes use with children. They do not know. She asked how Lily was feeling, whether she was eating, whether she felt safe. Lily answered each question in the composed and direct way she had of addressing adults she was meeting for the first time. Then Dorothea asked gently whether Lily would like to go home with her father. The hollow went very quiet. Even the fire seemed to reduce itself. Lily looked past Dorothea at Derek, who was standing in the entrance with the winter light framing him from behind. She held his gaze for several seconds with her dark, serious eyes. Then she looked back at Dorothea. She said this was her home. She said it without drama or emotion, the way you state something that is simply true and requires no further argument. Dorothea wrote something in her notebook. She stood up and thanked Lily. She turned to Eleanor and said she would be in touch, that there was a process she was bound to follow, but that she had recorded everything she needed to record. She said it in a tone that was neither warm nor cold, the neutral professionalism of someone doing their job carefully. Derek said Dorothea's name. She said she had what she needed, and they could speak in her office about the process going forward. He began to say something else. She said his name once in the tone that ended conversations. They went back down the hill. Eleanor stood at the entrance and watched them go. Derek did not look back. Dorothea looked back once briefly, and her eyes met Eleanor's for a moment, before she turned and continued down the slope. Eleanor went back inside and sat down beside Lily. Lily leaned against her without speaking. Eleanor said nothing either, but she understood now with the complete clarity that comes from seeing a concealed plan move into open execution what Derek intended. Not simply to remove her from the house, to secure sole legal authority over Catherine's child. Without Eleanor as a legal guardian or even a recognized presence in Lily's life, Derek had complete freedom to sell the house, move to Seattle, and manage Lily's existence according to his own calculations, which had never included room for an elderly mother-in-law who had a prior claim on his daughter's heart. Eleanor pressed her hand flat against the dirt floor of the hollow. She felt the ground beneath her palms solid and cold. and completely indifferent to everything that human beings did on its surface, enduring in the way that the earth endures, which is to say, absolutely and without exception. She thought about Harold. She went back to work. The storm came without sufficient warning. Montana Weather Service advisories required a radio or a phone to receive, and Eleanor had neither, and so the first indication that something serious was building was the quality of the air on the afternoon of the 14th day. Something in the pressure, a particular tightening, a stillness that was different from ordinary cold stillness, in a way she recognized from 40 years of sharing Harold's attention to these things. He had always been able to read what was coming from the feel of the air, hours before it arrived. She spent 3 hours before dark doing everything she could do. She reinforced the stakes holding the tarp, packing additional stones around each one. She added more mud to the frame around the glass, working the cold mud into every gap she could find. She made 2 hard trips down the hill and back up with every piece of dry fuel she could carry, stacking it against the interior wall until there was no more space for it. She filled the plastic bin and every container she had with clean snow from the far side of the hollow, where the rock overhang kept it uncontaminated because clean water was going to matter. The storm arrived before midnight. The wind first a sustained assault that tested every seal she had made. Then snow, horizontal and dense, the kind that does not fall so much as drive pushing itself into every gap it could find. Eleanor heard it hit the glass wall and felt the frame shudder, and held herself still until it steadied. The bracing stones on the downhill side were doing their work. The mud seals held. Inside the hollow, the 3 of them stayed close to the fire. Cooper had been declining for 2 days. Eleanor had tracked it with the same careful, ongoing attention she gave to everything that mattered, noting the changes the way you note changes in anything important whose status is uncertain. He was not eating. His breathing had developed a quality she recognized and was not ready to name aloud. His eyes, which had been clear and alert through all the early weeks on the hill, had gone dull at the edges in the way that very old animals sometimes look when they are being required to spend more energy on basic function than they have reserves to easily provide. Lily had noticed too. She sat with his head in her lap through the worst hours of the first night of the storm, her small hands moving through his fur with the slow rhythm of someone who understands that presence itself is a form of care. She spoke to him in her quiet, steady voice, the private voice she used only for Cooper, as if they were still having their reasonable conversation, and she was giving him all the time he needed to answer. She asked Eleanor very quietly whether Cooper was dying. Eleanor looked at the old dog lying across Lily's lap, at his gray muzzle and his slow breath. She thought about the various ways she could answer this. She chose the honest one. She said she did not know. She said he was old, and the cold was hard, and those 2 things together were a significant challenge. She said they would do everything they could, and that was the true answer. Lily nodded. Her hands kept moving. By the second night, the temperature outside had fallen to negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Eleanor knew this from the thermometer she checked twice daily and recorded in the margins of Lily's reading book. Negative 22 outside. Inside the hollow, the thermometer read 19 degrees. Cold enough to be genuinely dangerous, but not negative 22. The glass was holding. The stone was holding. The differential between outside and inside was the product of 2 weeks of work and observation, and in the worst hours of the second night, Eleanor held those degrees of difference in her mind, the way you hold a fact that you have earned rather than been given. She talked to Harold that night, not in the interior way she usually did, but out loud in a low voice below the sound of the storm. because the storm was loud enough that there was privacy in it. She told him about the 7 degrees. She said she thought he would have found it interesting, the thermal mass performing almost exactly as he had described. She said she was frightened. She said it without apology because Harold had always believed that honest accounting of fear was more useful than pretending it was not present. On the 3rd morning of the storm, footsteps came up the hill through the crusted snow. Eleanor heard them before she saw who it was, and moved to the entrance before the figure came around the last curve of the trail. A man broad through the chest carrying a pack, moving with the unhurried, deliberate pace of someone who has made a decision and is carrying it out without drama. She had seen him before, several times at the base of the hill, watching from a distance with an expression she had never been close enough to read. He had never spoken to her. He had never joined the groups offering unsolicited advice from the road. He had simply watched. He stopped a few feet from the entrance and said he was not there to cause trouble. He said he had seen the storm coming and thought she might need some things. Eleanor looked at him. He opened the pack. Dog food. A small heating pad that ran on a battery pack. Several pouches of instant soup. Thick wool socks. He said it was not much. She looked at the items and felt something move through her that she had not felt in the past several weeks. Not gratitude exactly, though. That was part of it. Something closer to the recognition that she was not, despite all the evidence of the past weeks, entirely alone in this. She asked why he had come. He looked at her with steady gray eyes. He said he had spent his life watching people fail quietly when someone with half a mind could have helped. He said he did not want to watch that again. He left the pack and went back down the hill without asking for anything. His name, she would learn, was Gus Pruitt. He had lived in Millhaven for 20 years after arriving from somewhere in Idaho, with no particular story the town had attached to him, and no family anyone knew of. He would continue to come up the hill twice a week reliably with whatever he thought might be useful, and he would never once describe himself as a helper or ask for acknowledgement of any kind. That night, with the heating pad placed near Cooper at its lowest safe setting, the old dog ate for the first time in 2 days. Not much. A few careful bites. But he ate, and his breathing steadied enough that Eleanor was able to close her eyes for 2 consecutive hours before dawn, without being pulled awake by the sound of it. She woke to pale light coming through the glass. The storm had eased. Outside, snow lay thick and undisturbed across the hillside. The valley below was nearly invisible, Millhaven swallowed to its rooflines in the drift lines. It looked like a place that had been temporarily set aside. Lily was sitting up looking at the back wall of the hollow. Eleanor followed her gaze. In the planting bed in the soil they had amended and seeded and tended, something had come through the surface. 3 or 4 slender green shoots barely an inch tall. Pale and fragile, their tips curved slightly from the effort of emergence, but unmistakably green, unmistakably alive. Growing in a rock hollow in December in Montana, while the thermometer outside read -22. Lily reached out and touched one with the very tip of her finger, as gently as if it might decide to change its mind. She said they were real. Eleanor sat forward on her knees and looked at those small green things for a long time without speaking. She had put the seeds in with hope and methodology and without any promise she could honestly make about the outcome. The sight of them was more convincing than anything anyone had said or offered in the weeks since she had come to this hill. She said yes, they were real. The news moved through Millhaven the way news moved through small towns in pieces, and with embellishment changing shape with each retelling. Someone had mentioned the smoke from the hill, and someone else had mentioned what Aldous Ketterman had said about the glass. and the story of what Eleanor Marsh was doing in the rocks had accumulated over the weeks into something that people discussed in the diner and at the hardware store and outside the school in tones that ranged from concern to skeptical, to something that, while not yet admiring, was at least genuinely curious. People came to look, not all of them and not all at once, but in a slow, increasing trickle that Eleanor chose not to discourage or encourage. She went about her work and let it speak. Some called things up from the trailhead. One man said she was stubborn and it would get her killed. A woman said something about children not raising themselves that she then had to partially retract because it had not come out the way she intended. Someone said someone needed to step in before it got worse. Eleanor heard all of it. She went back to adjusting the angle of the glass. And then the food in the valley ran out. It happened the way most serious things happen gradually. And then, suddenly, the storm had closed the main road for 4 days. The grocery had not received a delivery in 6. The church pantry was empty. Families that had been managing on reserves found the reserves were gone. The first person to come to the Hollow for food was Beverly Crane, who owned the hair salon on Main Street, and who had, at some point in the second week, Eleanor was on the hill, referred to her in public as a spectacle. Eleanor knew this because Lily had overheard it at the church and reported it with the careful precision of a child who understands that certain information is important even when its purpose is not yet clear. Beverly Crane stood at the entrance of the Hollow with her coat buttoned wrong and her hands shaking slightly, and 2 expressions competing for control of her face. The pride that had always been her dominant register, and the desperation that was winning. She said she would not have come if she had another option. Eleanor looked at her. She looked at the woman who had called her a spectacle, who had laughed at the smoke from the hillside, who had not in 6 weeks offered anything but judgment. Then she looked at the green shoots at the back of the Hollow, and at Lily, who had come to stand beside her, because that was where she always stood when something important was happening. Eleanor reached for the bundle of greens she had harvested that morning and wrapped them in a piece of cloth. She held them out. Beverly Crane looked at the bundle. Then she looked at Eleanor. Something moved across her face that was neither pride nor desperation, but something older and more fundamental than either. She took it. She said, "Thank you," in a voice that was barely audible. Lily watched her go back down the hill. Then she looked up. She said that woman had called her a spectacle. Eleanor said she knew. Lily thought about this carefully. She said that did not seem like a reasonable thing to do, and then go ask for food. Eleanor said no, it was not. Lily asked why they gave it to her anyway. Eleanor thought about how to answer in a way that was both true and useful for an 8-year-old who was going to be living in the world for a long time after this winter was done. She said because what Beverly Crane had said about her did not change what Beverly Crane needed. That letting someone go without food because they had been unkind to you was the same kind of error Beverly had made, deciding that someone else did not deserve the consideration they deserved. She said the point was not to be better than Beverly had been. The point was to not make the same mistake. Lily turned this over. She said it would have been easier to just not give her anything. Eleanor said yes. Most of the right things were harder than the alternatives. That was more or less how you could tell the difference. After that, the visits came steadily. Families in the morning, individuals in the afternoon. People who came with their own versions of shame and need, and who left with whatever Eleanor could spare and said. She gave what she could and stated clearly and without apology when she could give no more. The mathematics were narrowing. She knew it, and she thought about it at night while Lily slept and Cooper breathed and the fire did its patient work. And she thought about what came after the narrowing. She did not know yet that Dorothea Vance had reopened her file on Eleanor Marsh and was reading her own field notes with the careful attention of someone reconsidering a situation in light of new evidence. She did not know that Gus Pruitt had been talking to people in town in his quiet, unhurried way, saying things she would not learn about until later. She did not know that Derek Holt had retained an attorney in Billings, and that the attorney had filed a motion in district court, and that the motion was on a clerk's desk in Great Falls, with a hearing date attached to it. What she knew was the hollow and the work and Lily asleep beside her, and the weight of a responsibility she had chosen and would not put down. Outside, the wind moved across the hills with what almost felt in that exhausted hour like something close to gentleness. Inside the hollow, Eleanor Marsh sat in the firelight, with her cloth-wrapped hands resting open on her knees, and she breathed and she thought, and she did not stop. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Gus Pruitt carried it up the hill tucked inside his coat, and he handed it to Eleanor without preamble and stood back while she read it, his gray eyes steady and his hands in his pockets, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has already thought about what he wants to say and decided that most of it should wait for her to finish. The letter was from the District Court of Cascade County. It informed Eleanor Marsh that a motion had been filed by Derek Holt, represented by an attorney in Billings, requesting an emergency modification of guardianship on the grounds that Eleanor lacked a fixed legal residence and was therefore unable to provide the stable living environment required by Montana state law for the care of a minor child. A hearing had been scheduled 10 days from the date on the letter. Eleanor was advised to seek legal representation. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands, for a moment feeling the specific weight of it. Gus said he was sorry. Eleanor said he had nothing to be sorry for. She asked how he had come to have it. He said the postmaster had called him, knowing he had some connection to the situation on the hill, knowing Eleanor had no address for official mail. He said the postmaster was a practical woman who believed that important documents should find the people they were addressed to. Eleanor thanked him and said she needed a few hours with it. He nodded and went back down the hill. Lily was at the back of the hollow tending the planting beds, her small fingers moving carefully around the base of the shoots. She had not heard the exchange. She looked up when Eleanor came back inside. She asked what the paper was. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, at the child who had told a caseworker from county, "This is my home," in a voice that required no argument at the 8-year-old who had carried glass up a frozen hillside and pressed mud into gaps with her bare hands, and given food to people who had not been kind, and who had done all of it without complaint or request for acknowledgement. She said it was something she needed to take care of, that Lily did not need to worry about it. Lily looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes that missed very little. She said okay, and went back to the plants. Eleanor sat with her back against the stone wall and looked at the hollow around her and thought about what she had to work with. The temperature log, the photographs that Gus had taken with the old camera he had brought one afternoon without explanation, the data on the planting beds, the signed accounts from every family who had received food during the supply shortage, whom she had asked to write down what they had received, and when, keeping the record the way she kept all records, because she had always believed that documented truth was more durable than remembered truth, and she had the town itself, not all of it, but the 11 families who had started building their own hollow structures on the hillsides north of Millhaven, the people who had come to the hollow not for food but for information, to understand how it worked, to ask questions. She answered as completely as she could. These people existed because they had watched Eleanor work, and decided to try the thing they had been laughing at. She thought about this for a long time. By morning, she knew what she was going to do. She asked Gus the next day whether he thought people would come if she invited them to the hollow, not for food or for help, just to see what it actually was with evidence before a court heard someone else's description of it. Gus pulled at his gray beard. He said he thought they would come if they understood why they were being asked. She said she wanted to show the town what the hollow was before Derek's lawyer told a judge what it was. She said she wanted Millhaven to understand what was being asked to be dismissed. Gus looked at her for a moment. He said he would make sure people knew. He did. Within 3 days, she heard from the visitors to the hollow that there was going to be a gathering at the hill on Saturday morning. She did not know exactly what Gus had said or to whom. He was not a man who explained his methods, and she did not ask. Saturday came cold and clear. The Montana winter sky above Millhaven, a shade of blue so bright and aggressive, it seemed almost confrontational in its clarity. Eleanor was up before dawn, adjusting the glass and checking the temperature readings and tending the plants. She braided Lily's hair and tied it with a strip of cloth. Lily asked what was happening today. Eleanor said people were coming to see what they had built. Lily looked around at the walls and the light and the green things at the back. She said she thought it was pretty good. Eleanor said she thought so too. They came in groups of 2 and 3, making their way up the trail in the cold morning. By 10 o'clock, there were close to 40 people on the hillside. Eleanor recognized most of them. Former students, now adults with their own children. Neighbors she had known for decades. Beverly Crane in her good wool coat. Aldous Ketterman with his coffee thermos. The postmaster. People she did not recognize who appeared to have driven from other parts of the county. And Derek, standing at the back of the group with his coat dark among the others. His face arranged in its careful, neutral expression. His hands in his pockets. He had come alone. His attorney was not with him. Eleanor noted this and put it aside. She stood at the entrance and looked at the assembled faces of Millhaven and felt something she had not expected to feel. She had anticipated vulnerability, the specific exposure of being seen by people who had doubted her. Instead, she felt the steadiness of someone who has done the work and is prepared to account for it. She began talking. She talked about the hollow, the way she had always talked about difficult things in her classroom directly, and without condescension, assuming that the people in front of her were capable of understanding if the information was given to them clearly. She explained thermal mass and what it meant. She described the angle of the glass and why it was positioned as it was. She showed them the temperature log 6 weeks of twice-daily readings in the margins of Lily's reading book. She showed them the planting beds and the green shoots that had come through -22 degrees and continued growing. She described what the hollow had produced during the worst weeks of the winter and how much of it had been shared with families in the valley. She stated the numbers without embellishment. She pointed to the 11 structures on the surrounding hillsides and said that each one represented a family that had taken what she had learned and applied it, that the knowledge was not complicated, that it came from paying attention to what the earth was already doing. Then she looked at the assembled faces of people she had known most of her life and said what she had come to say. She said she had spent 32 years teaching in this town. She said she had taught most of the people standing on this hillside how to read, how to reason, how to look at something they did not understand and keep looking until they did. She said she had not stopped doing that work. She had simply moved the classroom. The hillside was quiet. She said she understood there was a legal question before the court about whether she was capable of providing a stable and safe environment for her granddaughter. She said she would leave that question to the court because that was the appropriate venue for it. But she wanted the people of Millhaven to understand what the question actually meant. It was asking whether a woman who had kept a child warm and fed and healthy and intellectually engaged through the worst winter in 20 years in a structure built by hand from materials other people had discarded using knowledge accumulated over a lifetime and applied with care and precision, was capable of providing stability. She said she thought they had enough information to form their own view. She stopped talking. The hillside held its silence for a few seconds. Then Beverly Crane, standing in the middle of the group in her good coat, with her hands clasped in front of her, said that she had come to this hollow 3 weeks ago in a state she was not proud of. She said what she had found had not been what she expected to find. She said she thought Eleanor Marsh was the most competent person she had encountered in 40 years of living in Millhaven, and that she was prepared to say so wherever it was required. Someone said yes, then several more. Derek had not moved from the back of the group. His face had gone through several expressions during Eleanor's account and had arrived at something she could not precisely name. Not the satisfaction of a man who holds the stronger position, not the defeat of one who has lost it, but something between those two states that she did not have a word for and chose not to spend time trying to find. She looked at him for a moment and then looked away. She did not feel triumph. She felt the deep fatigue of someone who has been carrying something very heavy and is not yet able to put it down. Lily appeared at her side. She had been inside with Cooper during the gathering and had apparently decided that whatever was happening outside had reached a point where her presence was appropriate. She stood beside Eleanor and looked out at the assembled faces of the town. Cooper was beside her. He had been improving for 2 weeks, not in any dramatic way, but in the accumulation of small, better days that constitutes real recovery in old animals. He was eating. His eyes had recovered their warmth. He moved at his own pace, careful and unhurried, with the steady, deliberate confidence of an animal who has decided the ground is worth trusting again. Lily reached up and took Eleanor's hand. She did not say anything. She stood there with her small hand in Eleanor's cloth-wrapped hand and looked at the people of Millhaven looking back at them. The hearing was held on the 18th of January in the district courthouse in Great Falls, a 2-hour drive from Millhaven on roads that were that morning clear and dry, under a winter sky that had decided to cooperate with the proceedings. Gus drove them in his truck. He had offered 4 days earlier, standing at the hollow entrance with his hands in his pockets, saying simply that he had a truck and he knew the route. Eleanor wore the dark blue sweater she had carried in her duffel bag. Since the first night, the one she had kept folded at the bottom for occasions that required it. It had been folded there for 7 weeks. Lily wore her best clothes clean and pressed as carefully as the hollow permitted. Cooper stayed on the hill. Gus had arranged for Aldous Ketterman to sit with him. The courtroom smelled of old wood and radiator heat, a combination that struck Eleanor as almost unbearably familiar after 7 weeks in a stone hollow. She sat at a table with Patricia Oakes, a legal aid attorney from Great Falls, who had contacted Eleanor 3 days after the gathering on the hill, having heard about the situation through a chain of communication that apparently originated with Beverly Crane. Patricia was 38, extremely direct, and had looked at Eleanor's temperature log and Gus's photographs and the signed statements from 11 families and said without sentiment that she thought they had a case. Derek sat at the opposite table with his attorney from Billings, a man with a precise haircut and the confident manner of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room he entered. The judge was a woman named Hargrove in her late 50s. She read the motion and the response with the unhurried attention of someone who takes her work seriously. She asked several questions of Derek's attorney, who answered them with polished efficiency. He described the hollow as an inadequate and unsafe dwelling for a minor. He described Eleanor's choices as evidence of poor judgment. He used the phrase unstable living circumstances 4 times. Eleanor counted. Then Judge Hargrove turned to Patricia Oakes. Patricia submitted the documentation, the temperature log, the photographs, the signed statements from 11 families, a written account from Aldous Ketterman detailing the glass and the conversation at his barn. She submitted one more item, something Eleanor had not known was coming. A formal letter on county letterhead from Dorothea Vance. Patricia read the key passage aloud. Dorothea wrote that she had conducted a welfare assessment of the minor child on the 21st of December. She wrote that the child was in good physical health, appropriately nourished, cognitively engaged, and emotionally secure. She wrote that the living environment, while unconventional by any standard she typically applied, demonstrated a level of intentional design and practical competence she had rarely encountered in 11 years of child welfare work. She wrote that she had assessed hundreds of homes over the course of her career, including many that were conventional in every outward respect and profoundly unsafe in every meaningful one. She wrote that the hollow on the north hillside of Millhaven was not among those. She wrote that in her professional assessment, Eleanor Marsh was providing her granddaughter with exactly the kind of stable, attentive, and purposeful care that the court's standard was designed to protect. The courtroom was quiet when Patricia finished. Derek's attorney said the letter represented the opinion of a single caseworker and was not binding on the court. Judge Hargrove said she was aware of that. She looked at the documentation for a long moment. Then she looked at Eleanor, who sat with her hands folded on the table and her back straight, and her face arranged in the composed expression of someone who has decided that honest accounting is the only territory worth occupying. The judge asked Eleanor directly whether she had a plan for permanent housing. Eleanor said yes, that she had been in contact with the County Housing Assistance Office about a property on the south edge of Millhaven. A small house, 2 bedrooms within the parameters of the assistance program. That she intended to apply as soon as the court had made its determination, and had reason to believe the application would be processed within 30 days. The judge asked how she knew this. Eleanor said the postmaster had helped her make the inquiries. Something crossed the judge's face that might have been the beginning of a smile if the courtroom had been a place where that was permitted. She asked Derek if he had anything to add. Derek looked at his attorney. The attorney reiterated the unstable living circumstances argument with slightly different phrasing. The judge said she had heard him. She looked at her documents. Then she said that the court's concern in any matter of this kind was the welfare and stability of the minor child, and that the standard for that determination was not the conventional appearance of a living situation, but its actual capacity to meet the child's physical and emotional needs. She said the documentation before her indicated that the child was healthy, safe, engaged, and in the care of someone who had demonstrated under conditions the court found remarkable a sustained and serious commitment to her well-being. She said the motion was denied. She said it in the same even tone she had used throughout because it was a legal determination and not a performance. Derek's attorney said something about an appeal. The judge said that was his client's right. Eleanor sat for a moment after the gavel and simply breathed. The deep, steady breath of someone who has been holding their ground for 7 weeks and feels it finally acknowledged as solid. Patricia gathered her papers. Lily, who had been sitting very still beside Eleanor throughout the hearing in the particular stillness she used when something mattered, let out a long, slow breath of her own. She reached over and put her hand on Eleanor's arm. Eleanor covered it with her own. They drove back to Millhaven in the early afternoon, the mountains large and white on both sides of the highway. The sky still that aggressive January blue. Gus drove without talking, which was the right choice, and Eleanor sat in the passenger seat watching the landscape go by and thinking nothing specific for the first time in weeks. Just the mountains and the road and the winter light she had been studying so closely for so long that she had come to know it like a language. Lily fell asleep in the back seat with her head against the window. When they reached Millhaven, Gus asked if she wanted to go to the hill or somewhere else. She said the hill. Cooper was at the entrance when they came up the trail, standing in his careful way, his tail making its small, reliable arc when he saw them. Aldous Ketterman was sitting on a flat rock nearby, with his thermos, having apparently decided that the sitting was worth staying for. He asked how it went. Eleanor said they were staying. He nodded as if this were the answer he had expected, and poured 3 cups without being asked. The weeks that followed had a different quality. Not easier exactly, because Montana in late January does not become easy, but different in the way things become different when the worst outcome has been named and survived. You stop spending energy on the fear of it. You put that energy back into the work. The planting beds produce steadily, roots and shoots and the beginning of something that could be called with appropriate modesty a food source. Eleanor started a second bed in the section of the hollow where the glass produced the most consistent solar gain. Lily had taken over the daily tending of the plants, keeping her own notes in the back of her reading book, recording what she observed each morning. What had grown, what had not, what she had tried differently. It was, Eleanor thought, the beginning of a habit of mind that would serve her long after this winter was over. The 11 hollow structures on the surrounding hillsides continued to develop. Not all of them were working as well as Eleanor's, and she was honest with the people who came to ask her about the failures, explaining what she could, and acknowledging what she did not yet fully understand herself. She was still learning. Every structure that did not perform as expected was information about what the hollow was actually doing, and she took that information and revised her understanding accordingly. Gus came twice a week with whatever he had gathered. He never explained himself or asked for acknowledgement. He appeared and brought things and occasionally sat in the comfortable silence of someone who has nothing to prove, and then went back down the hill. Eleanor had stopped asking why and started simply accepting it as one of the reliable good things. One afternoon in early February, Beverly Crane came up the hill with nothing driving her but the desire to come. She stood at the entrance and looked around with the expression of someone seeing something for the first time, even though she had been there before, understanding it differently now. She asked if Eleanor would consider teaching in town at the community center, about the thermal principles, the planting, all of it, to whoever wanted to learn. Eleanor looked at her. She thought about the word teaching and how it had defined so much of her life and then been removed from her life without her choosing for that to happen, and how it was now being offered back in a form she would not have predicted. She said she would consider it. Beverly said she thought there would be more interest than Eleanor might expect. Eleanor said she had learned not to underestimate what people were capable of when circumstances made the value of something plain. Beverly looked at her for a moment and then looked away, and Eleanor could see in her profile the expression of someone working through something they do not quite have words for yet. She said she was sorry for the things she had said in the early weeks, Eleanor said she understood why she had said them. Beverly said that was not exactly an absolution. Eleanor said it was not meant to be. It was meant to be the truth. Beverly came to the first teaching session 2 weeks later, sitting in the third row at the community center on a Tuesday evening with her notebook open. There were 23 people at that session. By the third, there were 41. Eleanor taught the way she had always taught, directly and without condescension, assuming that the people in front of her were capable of understanding if the information was given to them honestly and clearly. She used her temperature log as a teaching document. She brought soil samples. She described her failures as carefully as her successes, because she had always believed that failure was the more instructive half of any learning. The housing application was approved in the third week of February. A small house on the south edge of Millhaven, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled of dust, and the particular neutral promise of an empty space. A yard that would need work when spring came. Eleanor and Lily moved in on a Saturday with Gus's truck and the few things they had accumulated on the hill. Cooper walked through the front door with his careful, measured steps and went through each room in turn, checking the corners and the smells and the particular quality of each space, then came back to the kitchen and sat beside Eleanor's leg and pressed his gray head against her knee. Lily walked through the rooms with the expression of someone learning the shape of a new thing. She said it was quiet. Eleanor said yes. Lily said she was not sure she was used to quiet anymore. Eleanor said she would get used to it. That quiet was not the same thing as empty. Lily thought about this. She said that in the hollow there had always been the wind, and that the wind had been a kind of company once she understood it was not going to stop. Eleanor said she understood that. That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in months, Eleanor looked at the ceiling and felt the warmth of the house around her. Not the warmth she had built degree by degree in a stone hollow measured and recorded and hard won. The ordinary, reliable warmth of a building that was doing what buildings do. She acknowledged it without taking it for granted, which she thought might be the most important thing this winter had taught her. She talked to Harold. She told him about the house. She described the kitchen and the yard and the window in Lily's room that faced south. She told him that Lily had already identified it as the best location for a planting bed when spring came and was making plans. She told him she understood now what he had meant. Sitting on the hillside in October sunshine, with his hand over hers, telling her to remember that place. She had taken him to mean the hollow, specifically the geological feature, the physical location. But that was not what he had meant. He had meant the knowledge, the understanding of how things worked when you paid close enough attention to them, the patience to work with what was actually present instead of what you wished were present, the willingness to be wrong and try again. He had meant all of it, and he had known she had it in her, and he had simply told her where to look when she needed to find it. He had been telling her she understood now that she already had everything she would need. She had just needed a winter to find out that it was true. The hollow did not close when they moved to the house. Eleanor had never intended for it to close. She went up 3 times a week through the rest of February and into March, maintaining the planting beds, observing the thermal performance, continuing to refine her understanding. She brought families from the Tuesday sessions with her, showing them directly what the documentation described in the abstract. In March, a man from the State Agricultural Extension Office drove up from Helena. He had heard about what Eleanor had done from a chain of communication that apparently involved the county housing office and the postmaster and possibly Beverly Crane and possibly others she would never know about. He spent 4 hours at the hollow asking questions and examining everything with the careful attention of someone who takes his work seriously. He asked if Eleanor would be willing to contribute her data to a study on low-technology thermal growing structures in high-altitude cold climates. Eleanor said she thought that would be useful. He said he thought so too. Spring came to Millhaven the way it always came, incrementally. And then, suddenly, snow retreated from the lower slopes. Mud appeared where ice had been. The exhausted, grateful relief of a Montana town that has made it through another winter, settled into the streets and the diners, and the conversations at the hardware store, the collective exhale of people who have survived something they know was genuinely hard. The Hollow's planting beds were at their most productive. In March, the accumulated work of soil amendment and consistent thermal management, yielding more than they had at any point in the winter. Eleanor harvested carefully and distributed what she could and documented everything. The 11 structures on the hillsides, most of them functional now, if not elegant, were being refined and improved as their builders learned from Eleanor's continued teaching and from each other. On a Saturday in late March, Eleanor and Lily went up the hill for what Eleanor understood would be for a while one of their last regular visits. The hollow would remain. She would maintain it. But spring was changing what was necessary, and she was beginning to think about the yard on the south edge of Millhaven. Lily walked the perimeter of the hollow, slowly touching the walls with her fingertips, looking at everything with the careful attention she gave to things she was trying to remember precisely. She stopped at the back wall and looked at the planting beds, which were green and productive, and doing their quiet work in the light coming through the glass. She said she did not want to forget this place. Eleanor said she would not forget it, that it was not the kind of thing a person forgot. Lily reached into her coat pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. She opened it carefully. It was a drawing she had made in her notebook, and torn out and folded small enough to carry. She had drawn the hollow from outside the glass wall, shining in winter light. Inside, 3 figures close together, one tall and 2 smaller, and a dog beside them. Above them, the stone curved inward on 3 sides, around the glass lines suggesting light coming through. She said she wanted to leave it there, so the hollow knew they had not forgotten. Eleanor looked at the drawing. She looked at Lily. She took it from her and carried it to the back wall to the stone surface just above the planting beds, where the light was best and the rock was smoothest. And she tucked the corner of the drawing into a crack in the stone, where it sat flush against the surface. She stepped back and looked at it. Lily came and stood beside her, and they looked at it together. The small drawing held in the stone the figures inside the light. Then Lily took Eleanor's hand, and they walked out of the hollow together into the March afternoon, which was cold still, but a different cold. The cold of a season that was losing the argument it had been making all winter. Cooper was waiting at the entrance. He had made it up the hill under his own power that day, the first time since before the big storm, slowly with the measured confidence of an animal who has decided to trust his legs again and found they were worth trusting. He looked at them with his clear, warm eyes, and his tail made its small, steady arc. Below Millhaven sat in the late afternoon light in the valley, smoke rising from chimneys thinner now, people moving through the streets, the town continuing in its ordinary way, but not entirely unchanged. There were structures on the hillsides that had not been there in November. There were families who had survived the hardest weeks in ways they had not known were available to them before Eleanor showed them. There were 41 people who had sat in a community center on Tuesday evenings and written down what a 68-year-old woman had learned from paying attention to the earth. Eleanor stood at the entrance of the hollow she had built from broken glass and cardboard and memory, and the knowledge of a man she still talked to every night. And she looked out at all of it, and she felt the particular quality of satisfaction that comes not from being proven right, though that had happened, and not from being praised, though that had happened too, but from having done the work honestly and completely, and having let it speak for itself. She had not beaten winter. She had learned from it. She had worked with it. She had refused to be moved by it, and it had, in the way of seasons, moved on without her. That was the difference. She had spent 68 years in this town, 32 of them teaching its children that the most important thing you could do with knowledge was share it. She had spent one winter proving to herself that she had not stopped believing that even when it would have been easier to stop, even when no one was watching, even when the watching was laughter. She reached down and took Lily's hand. They began the walk down the hill together, the three of them moving through the late March light, their shadows stretching east across the slope ahead of them, long and thin, and moving toward the small house on the south edge of town that smelled of dust and the particular neutral promise of everything that came next.